Nobody cries without a reason. And when one of the most mentally tough athletes on the planet breaks down in private, you pay attention. Aryna Sabalenka has faced match points, career controversies, geopolitical storms around her nationality, the specific agony of losing Grand Slam finals she should have won. She has never broken. That's what made this moment so striking. She didn't lose a match. She didn't suffer an injury. She heard a number. $500,000. Every month. For life. And something in her cracked open. To understand why that number hit so hard, you have to go back to where Alex Eala started, because nothing about her story follows the typical blueprint. She grew up in Manila with a borrowed racket and parents who had no roadmap for what they were nurturing. No federation support, no government academy, no financial infrastructure built to catch talented kids and carry them forward. Just a father who restructured his entire professional life to fit around her training schedule, and a mother who handled everything else: the travel, the logistics, the relentless emotional labor of believing in something before the world was ready to believe with you. That is the foundation this story sits on. Not glamour. Sacrifice. Real, sustained, unglamorous sacrifice across years. When Eala entered the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, she wasn't handed anything. She competed against kids from countries with deep tennis pipelines, players whose nations had invested decades into building the infrastructure that produces champions. She had her family and her talent, and somehow that was enough, because in 2022 she became the first Filipino ever to win a Grand Slam junior title, capturing the US Open girls singles crown in a performance that made seasoned tennis analysts do a double take. People who had watched this sport for decades paused, rewound, and asked themselves if they had read the scoreboard correctly. They had. She was real. And the cost of producing someone that real had been carried almost entirely by two people who never once asked for recognition. Here is what casual fans almost never think about. Behind every elite athlete is a financial gamble that most families are not equipped to take. Coaching fees, flights, hotels across multiple continents, equipment, tournament entry, years of this before any prize money exists. For families without institutional backing, choosing to pursue elite sport is not a career decision. It is an act of economic courage that gets renewed every single year. The Eala family made that choice over and over without fanfare, without anyone watching, without any guarantee it would ever pay off the way it eventually did. So when a prominent Philippine businessman, a figure connected to real estate, telecommunications, and regional finance, quietly approached the family through intermediaries, the offer he made was not structured like any sponsorship deal anyone in tennis had seen before. There were no performance clauses, no marketing requirements, no rankings thresholds to hit before payments kicked in. He was not buying access to her name or her image. He looked at what Michael and Ricky Eala had given across all those years, and he decided it deserved to be answered. $500,000 a month, deposited directly to her parents, unconditionally, for life. Not for anything. For everything they had already done. When that news began moving through Philippine business circles and eventually into sports media and then into international tennis coverage, the reactions split almost immediately. Some people saw it as exactly the kind of bold private investment that a sport with structural funding problems desperately needed. Others raised questions about what unconditional wealth might do to an athlete's drive, whether removing financial pressure from the equation might quietly erode the hunger that made her dangerous in the first place. Both conversations were reasonable, but neither of them was the reaction that actually stunned people. The reaction that stopped the tennis world came from Aryna Sabalenka. You have to understand who Sabalenka is before you can understand why her response mattered so much. This is not a soft athlete. She has navigated personal tragedy. She has carried the weight of Belarusian identity through periods of severe geopolitical tension, which meant competing under conditions most athletes never experience and most people never fully consider. She lost Grand Slam finals that seemed hers to take and then came back and won anyway. She is someone who has built her entire champion's identity on the refusal to be broken by external circumstances. She does not show weakness publicly. That is not performance. That is the psychological architecture of someone who has earned everything she has through sustained force of will. which is exactly why it mattered when she heard about the Eala arrangement and she cried. Not in front of cameras. Not in a press conference. In private. But these things travel. Word reached the press, and once it did, the interpretation machine activated at full speed. Filipino supporters took it as validation, proof that Eala's rise had become so significant that even the woman at the top of the sport had been moved by its implications. Sabalenka's own supporters pushed back hard, arguing that private emotional moments deserve protection from public speculation and that reducing a decorated champion to a reaction to someone else's story was unfair and reductive. Honestly, both sides had a point. What got buried in the noise, though, was the more truthful version of what probably happened in that private moment. People who know Sabalenka well, coaches, longtime training partners, people who have been around her long enough to see what exists beneath the competitive surface, suggest that her emotion wasn't really about Eala specifically. It was about what the offer represented at a deeper level. The recognition that unconditional support, the kind that does not come with an expiration date, does not require you to keep performing to justify its existence, does not evaporate the moment your results dip, is something almost no elite athlete ever receives. Every financial structure surrounding professional tennis is conditional. Sponsorships depend on rankings. Endorsements depend on visibility. Prize money depends on winning. Everything is tied to continued relevance and continued performance. One bad season, one serious injury, and the financial scaffolding starts to shift. The Eala family had just received something permanent. Something that said your sacrifice was enough on its own, regardless of what comes next. And Sabalenka, sitting at the very peak of the sport, surrounded by all the success she had earned, apparently felt the weight of that contrast in a way she hadn't anticipated. That is not jealousy. That is wisdom. That is someone who has competed long enough to understand exactly what unconditional support means and what it costs to operate your entire career without it. The tears were not weakness. They were the most honest thing she had shown the public in years. Meanwhile, Eala kept competing. That is the detail that deserves more credit than it usually gets. She did not get swept up in the media storm around her family's situation. She did not give interviews about the arrangement that turned into headlines. She understood, at a level that speaks to serious psychological maturity, that the only meaningful response to everything happening around her was to keep performing on the court. But the landscape had genuinely shifted, and the implications of that shift were not small. Consider what the offer actually changed in practical terms. For her entire career, Eala had operated with the background awareness that resources were limited. Not that her family was suffering, but that every decision carried weight. That there was no margin for wasted opportunities, no cushion to absorb a bad stretch without consequences. That awareness had shaped her. It contributed to the precision, the refusal to throw away points, the particular kind of focused hunger that opponents feel when they step across the net from someone who competes like everything matters, because for her, it always had. The question that genuinely fascinated the analysts paying closest attention was not whether this money would make her soft. Champions built the way she is built do not soften when circumstances improve. The real question was what happens when genuine freedom replaces constant background pressure. What becomes possible for an athlete of that caliber when the cognitive and emotional bandwidth previously spent managing financial anxiety gets redirected entirely toward competition? The evidence from comparable situations across elite sport points in one direction. That kind of liberation does not diminish performance. It expands it. And that prospect, more than any singular match result, more than any ranking movement, more than any tearful champion, was what made the Philippine tennis community feel something close to electric. There is also a larger story here that goes beyond two players and one extraordinary financial arrangement. For decades, women's tennis excellence has flowed from specific geographic pipelines. Eastern Europe, the United States, Western Europe. That was not coincidence. It was the product of sustained infrastructure, deep coaching ecosystems, generations of national investment in the sport. The emergence of a genuine elite player from Southeast Asia is structurally different from an outlier who trains in European academies and gets absorbed into existing systems. Eala is not adapting to an established framework. She arrived with the cultural weight of an entire nation's hunger behind her. Filipino supporters do not follow her matches the way typical tennis fans follow their favorites. They mobilize. Organized viewing events, coordinated social media, stadium attendance that transforms her matches into something that feels like a national event. Sabalenka had noticed. Players at her level notice everything. Behind closed doors, her team had been flagging Eala's development with increasing seriousness, not because her ground strokes were suddenly different, but because she was not approaching the top of women's tennis as an individual story. She was approaching it as a movement. And movements cannot be defeated on a single afternoon. The rivalry between them had already carried a charge that standard WTA matchups rarely generate before any of this happened. Sabalenka brought power and experience and the institutional authority of a proven champion. Eala brought hunger and precision and the specific fearlessness of someone who had already proven every doubter wrong. Spectators felt it. Broadcasters felt it. The WTA felt it. And now the conditions under which that rivalry would continue had permanently changed. Sabalenka's tears in that private moment were not just an emotional response to news. They were the recognition of a champion who is experienced enough to understand that the variables surrounding competition determine outcomes at the margins. In tight third sets, in crucial tiebreaks, in the moments where championships are actually decided, the gap between players of similar talent is rarely about the shot itself. It is about everything surrounding the shot. The mental state, the clarity, the presence, the absence of background noise. She understood what it meant for Eala to compete from a foundation of complete security. And she felt it. The story is not finished. It is barely started. The courts are still there. The points still have to be played. The championships still have to be decided in tight moments under enormous pressure. But the conditions under which that competition will unfold shifted permanently the day a Philippine businessman decided that recognizing extraordinary sacrifice was worth $500,000 a month for the rest of a family's life. Alex Eala didn't just gain financial security for her parents. She gained freedom. A kind of freedom that very few athletes at her level have ever competed with. Aryna Sabalenka didn't just cry. She acknowledged in the most unguarded moment of her recent public life that the rivalry ahead of her would be unlike anything behind her. And women's tennis, whether the governing bodies and the analysts and the commentators are ready to say it clearly, just entered a chapter that nobody has a map for.